What the Study Says.
Welcome back to What the Study Says.
I'm Dr. May.
And I'm Dr. Guy.
You know, the world of sports, particularly football, has really been buzzing lately.
Yeah, absolutely. We saw those headlines about former NFL player Jason Kelce.
Right, stating quite openly that he can virtually guarantee he has CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, from his long and pretty brutal NFL career.
That's a really powerful statement, isn't it?
It is, and it immediately highlights this growing concern, among athletes, former athletes, and frankly, anyone who follows these sports about the long-term effects of all those head impacts.
Definitely. It really hits home because it connects to a fear that many people who've played contact sports probably have.
But it also points to just how complicated understanding conditions like CTE actually is, especially when someone is still alive.
Exactly. And that's really what we want to do today.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to take a deep dive into what the science currently tells us about CTE. We're going straight to the research papers, the studies, the brain bank findings that you shared. Okay. We'll unpack what CTE actually is, how scientists have been studying it, and what we can, confidently say about its link to sports like football based on these sources.
Sounds good. Let's jump in.
Okay, so maybe start us off. Based on the studies, what exactly is chronic traumatic encephalopathy?
Right. So the sources define CTE as a neurodegenerative disease. Basically, that just means it's a condition where brain cells progressively sort of break down and stop working properly over time.
And this isn't something totally new, is it? The idea has been around for a while.
That's right, yeah. The sources point out that variations of it have been recognized, believe it or not, since the 1920s.
Wow, really?
Yeah, initially described in boxers, it was called punch-drunk syndrome back then.
Punch-drunk. Very descriptive, if not exactly scientific.
Definitely paints a picture.
So the sources talk about specific findings in the brain. How do researchers actually know if someone had CTE?
Okay, this is a really crucial point that the sources hammer home. CTE is currently diagnosed post-mortem.
After death.
Exactly. Through a very detailed examination of the brain tissue itself, under a microscope, essentially. They're looking for very specific microscopic signs.
And what are those signs? What's the main thing they're looking for, according to these studies?
The absolute key finding, the sort of hallmark signature the sources describe, is the presence of an abnormal form of a protein called tau. Specifically, it's hyperphosphorylated tau, or p-tau.
Okay.
Basically, it's tau protein that's chemically changed and starts clumping together, forming these aggregates.
Abnormal tau clumps. Now, that sounds familiar. Isn't that also involved in, say, Alzheimer's disease?
That's a great question, and this is where the details in the sources become really, really important.
Okay.
While both conditions involve abnormal tau, the sources are very clear that the location and the pattern of these p-tau deposits in CTE are distinct. They're different from Alzheimer's. In CTE, these p-tau clumps are often found clustered around small blood vessels, and they're deep within the folds, the sulci of the brain's outer layer, the cortex. They appear in different kinds of brain cells, too, neurons and glial cells.
Right, so it's not just that there's bad tau, but where it is specifically that defines CTE pathology in these studies.
Precisely.
But where does tau usually show up first in Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
Just for comparison.
According to the sources, in typical Alzheimer's disease, the tau tangles usually start in different places, like the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex areas, really vital for memory.
Oh, okay.
And then it might spread. But this pattern in CTE around the blood vessels and in the depths of the sulci in the cortex, that's noted as a key feature of CTE.
Got it. So specific tau in specific places is the main marker. Do the sources mention any other signs of damage in these brains?
Yes, they do. The studies often detail other findings, especially when the disease is more advanced. Things like some general loss of neurons or damage in the cortex, signs of inflammation like increased activity from certain support cells in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes evidence of tiny past bleeds near blood vessels. On a larger scale, what you might see just looking at the brain, the sources describe things like the brain shrinking overall or the fluid-filled spaces inside getting bigger, all consistent with, a degenerative process.
The sources also mentioned a specific case study, didn't they? A retired NFL player from one of the early important reports.
They did, yeah. That case is quite interesting. It described the player's symptoms before he died, things like cognitive impairment, memory problems, mood issues, and even movement problems similar to Parkinson's disease.
And the autopsy.
Crucially, the autopsy confirmed he had that distinctive CTE tau pathology. They also found some other things like amyloid plaques, which we associate with Alzheimer's, but the tau tangles weren't really prominent in the hippocampus.
Reinforcing that difference.
Exactly, even when both types of pathology might be present. And his genetics, his APOE genotype, was E3E3, not the E4 variant, sometimes linked to higher Alzheimer's risk.
Okay, so we have a clearer picture of the pathology and the postmortem diagnosis. Now, let's pivot to that connection everyone talks about, like with Jason Kelce's comment, the link to sports. Who is affected based on these sources?
Right. The evidence strongly linking CTE to repetitive head injuries, or RHIs, especially from contact sports, is a major focus in the research provided.
And brain bank studies are key here.
They've been really informative, yes. But, and this is a really important but that the sources themselves highlight, these brain banks often rely on donations.
Meaning
Families who've watched a loved one struggle with neurological symptoms might be more likely to donate their brain for study. So these samples, while incredibly valuable, aren't necessarily representative of all athletes. They might be skewed towards people who had symptoms.
that's a critical caveat to keep in mind. So acknowledging that, what did these brain bank studies find in the samples they did analyze?
Well, one study that gets a lot of attention, highlighted in the sources, looked at deceased football players in a brain bank. It found a remarkably high prevalence of CTE in that specific sample.
How high?
In that group, 110 out of 111 former NFL players studied showed neuropathological evidence of CTE.
Wow. 110 out of 111. That's 99%.
99%. It's a figure that certainly grabs your attention.
Absolutely. Did that study look at other levels of play, too?
It did. Within their sample, they found CTE pathology in 21% of the high school players, 91% of the college players, and then that 99% of the NFL players.
So it suggests a kind of gradient, like the risk might increase with higher levels of play, maybe longer exposure.
That's what the pattern in that specific sample suggests, yes. More exposure, higher level, potentially higher risk.
Football gets most of the headlines, but the sources mentioned other sports, too, right? It's not just football.
Correct. The sources discuss findings in other sports. We already mentioned boxing, where it was first described. One early sample found CTE in 17% of boxers. Soccer is discussed. There are case reports. Though the sources do note it's hard to accurately measure things like heading history and studies trying to link it to cognitive outcomes.
Sure. That makes sense.
Rugby is mentioned in case series. One study didn't find structural brain differences in young players versus controls. Another linked psychosocial issues, but not cognitive ones, to concussion history or genetics.
Yeah, hockey.
Similar story in one study mentioned retired players didn't show significant group differences in cognitive function, but there were psychosocial differences linked to concussion history or the APOE4 gene.
Interesting. Any others?
Yeah, one brain bank study looking at various sports exposures even identified a single case, stage 2 CTE, in a semi-pro baseball player.
Baseball. Okay, so while the football numbers, especially for former pros in these samples, are very high, the pathology isn't exclusive to football. It's been found across different contact sports.
That seems to be a fair takeaway from the data presented, yes. The sources also mentioned finding CTE pathology even in relatively young athletes under 30 in one brain bank sample.
Really? Under 30?
Yeah, in that group, about 41% overall had CTE, mostly milder stages, stage 1 or 2. The sports involved included football, ice hockey, soccer, rugby, and wrestling. And interestingly, for the young football players in that sample who did have CTE, they tended to have played for a longer duration.
Okay, that brings us to the symptoms, the lived experience. What kinds of symptoms are linked to CTE in these sources? And why is diagnosing it in someone living, like Jason Kelce wonders about, so difficult right now?
Well, the symptoms described cover a really wide range, which, adds to the complexity. You can group
Right.
them generally. There are cognitive symptoms, problems with memory, executive function like planning or decision-making, attention, language, maybe visuospatial skills. Then there are behavioral and mood symptoms. Things like impulsivity, depression, apathy, anxiety, maybe sudden anger or explosivity, even aggression. Suicidality is mentioned, social inappropriateness, sometimes paranoia or hallucinations.
That's a lot.
It is. And then, often in later stages, motor symptoms can appear affecting balance, movement, coordination, causing falls, tremors, sometimes trouble speaking or swallowing.
That sounds like an incredibly difficult set of potential issues.
Absolutely devastating for individuals and families. And this leads right into that major challenge the sources keep coming back to.
Diagnosis.
Exactly. CTE is only definitively diagnosed after death. through that specific brain tissue examination we talked about. There is currently no widely accepted clinical test, no scan, no blood test, nothing to diagnose CTE in a living person, though research is ongoing.
Ah, okay. So an athlete, even a former athlete with symptoms, can't go to the doctor today and get a test that confirms, yes, you have CTE. They might think they have it or worry they do, but it's not something that can be clinically diagnosed with while alive.
Precisely. And the sources actually looked at that idea directly with a study on what they called perceived CTE.
Perceived CTE.
Yeah. They found that a significant number of living former pro players in one study, about a third, reported that they believed they had CTE.
And what did they find about those players who believe they had it?
This is really striking. That perception, just the belief itself, was strongly associated with a heavy burden of reported health issues.
Like what?
Those who perceived they had CTE reported significantly higher rates of suicidality, 5 times greater in that study compared to those who didn't perceive they had it.
5 times greater. Wow.
Yeah. They also reported more symptoms of depression, anxiety, problems with emotional or behavioral control, more pain, and even low testosterone. So the belief is tied to very real reported suffering and mental health struggles, even without that definitive post-mortem confirmation.
That's incredibly powerful. The perception is linked to real health impacts. And you mentioned earlier, these symptoms could be from other things too, right?
Exactly. That's another layer of difficulty. The sources point out that symptoms like memory loss, mood swings, motor problems, these can overlap with many other conditions. Alzheimer's, Lewy body dementia, ALS, Parkinson's, and it's common when they do the autopsy on someone diagnosed with CTE to find other coexisting brain pathologies too. It's often not just one thing going on.
So given all these challenges, the symptom overlap, the postmortem diagnosis, the brain bank bias, what do the sources say are the big hurdles for researchers?
Several key things. We mentioned ascertainment bias in brain banks, that samples might not represent everyone. Finding good control groups is tough, especially for young donors, getting comparable data on head impacts and everything else.
Okay.
Often there's limited info on donors about crucial factors like past psychiatric history, socioeconomic background, substance use, which some sources note was common in certain samples, family history, all things that definitely impact brain health and symptoms.
Right. All potential confounders.
Exactly. The sources even question if the symptoms seen in some young athletes are truly specific to early-stage CTE, because they note many young symptomatic brain donors in one study actually didn't have CTE pathology at autopsy.
That really highlights it. It's not a straight line from impacts to symptoms to a guaranteed CTE diagnosis, at least not in living people, based on what we know now.
It seems much more complex than that, yes.
What about other factors, like genetics? Did the sources touch on that?
They did mention genetics briefly, particularly the APOE gene, apolipoprotein E.
Right.
Some sources discuss how the APOE4 variant is linked to a higher risk for Alzheimer's and maybe Alzheimer's-like changes after trauma. But they also stress that CTE pathology definitely occurs in people without the APOE4 variant.
Like that NFL player case study.
Exactly. He was E3E3. And some recent work mentioned suggests the frequency of different APOE versions in CTE cases might not actually be that different from the general population.
So genetics like APOE are part of the broader brain health picture. But based on these sources, it's not presented as the determining factor for CTE.
That seems fair to say, based on this material. The sources consistently emphasize that much more research is needed to really nail down the underlying mechanisms, how exactly impacts lead to CTE, and to figure out the true prevalence, the disease burden, in different groups.
Okay. So given all these difficulties in diagnosis and understanding the full picture, what do the sources say about treating or preventing CTE?
Well, based purely on the research material we reviewed for this deep dive, there's actually no discussion of specific treatments or any kind of cure for confirmed CTE mentioned. The focus is really on understanding the pathology and its associations.
Right. And prevention, any modern strategies discussed?
Similarly, again, sticking just to these sources talk about prevention is pretty limited. It mostly comes up in a historical context, like early rule changes in football centuries ago due to safety worries.
So no deep dive into current helmet tech or rule changes in these particular studies?
Not in the materials provided here, no. The research focus in these papers was definitely more on identifying the pathology and linking it to past exposures.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this then. What are the main takeaways from this deep dive into the science on CTE, according to these sources?
Okay, I think first, CTE is a distinct neurodegenerative disease. It's defined by a very specific pattern of abnormal tau protein found at autopsy.
Right. Distinct pathology.
Second, the research, especially from these brain bank studies, shows a really strong association between this CTE pathology and repetitive head impacts, particularly in contact sports like American football.
Okay, strong association with RHI. And
Third, despite the progress in identifying the pathology after death and finding these links, there are still significant gaps in our understanding. We don't really know the true prevalence across all athletes, let alone the general population.
and
Crucially, there's no validated test to diagnose CTE in a living person right now. And the precise cause and effect beyond just head impacts, plus other contributing factors, still needs a lot more investigation.
Yeah. So the symptoms someone experiences, while incredibly serious and needing care, aren't automatically proof of underlying CPE pathology,
No.
partly because symptoms overlap with other things, and we lack that living test.
Exactly. Which underscores why we desperately need more research, more rigorous studies across more diverse populations, not just focusing on the groups most likely to have symptoms or donate brains.
It really does. And it leaves you thinking, doesn't it, about that perceived CTE finding.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't get a diagnosis while alive, and your symptoms could be due to various things, how does the belief, the fear, the conviction that you have this specific serious condition affect your mental state, your well-being, maybe even contribute to some of those devastating outcomes like increased suicidality? It adds this whole psychological dimension on top of the biological uncertainty.
That's a profound point. It really highlights the complex interplay between medical knowledge, or lack thereof, personal experience, and mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you found this deep dive into what the studies are actually saying about CTE insightful, and you want to keep up with what the research shows on complex topics like this,
Make sure you subscribe and maybe share this with others who you think would find it interesting too.